On May 4th, 1970, the tranquility of the Kent State University campus was shattered. The Ohio National Guard opened fire on unarmed student protesters. 4 students lay dead. 9 others were wounded. The nation reeled in shock and disbelief. This tragedy became a searing indictment of the deep divisions within American society during the Vietnam War era. The protests at Kent State were fueled by deeply held convictions about the war, social injustice, and the very future of America. The students were demanding an end to a war they believed was morally wrong. They were demanding a voice in the decisions that shaped their lives. The events at Kent State were the culmination of years of growing unrest and disillusionment. The Vietnam War, with its mounting casualties and questionable objectives, had become a lightning rod for dissent. The decision to expand the war into Cambodia ignited a firestorm of protest across college campuses nationwide. Kent State became a tragic symbol of the government's heavy-handed response to these protests. The shootings marked a turning point in the anti-war movement, galvanizing opposition and further polarizing the nation. Rumors spread of outside agitators and radical elements hijacking the demonstrations. Some reports even suggested that the students had provoked the National Guard, putting themselves in harm's way. These attempts to discredit the protesters served only to obscure the very real and pressing issues at the heart of their dissent. The students at Kent State and on campuses across the country were motivated by a profound sense of moral outrage. They were witnessing the horrors of war firsthand as friends and classmates returned home in coffins or bearing the invisible scars of combat. They saw a government that seemed deaf to their pleas for peace and unresponsive to their concerns about the draft. They saw a system that seemed rigged against them, where their voices were silenced and their futures were mortgaged to a war they did not support. The Vietnam War cast a long shadow over American life in the late 1960s and early 1970s. What began as a distant conflict in Southeast Asia had escalated into a full-blown war, consuming American resources and claiming the lives of American soldiers at an alarming rate. The war, however, was not just a foreign policy crisis, it was a deeply divisive issue at home, tearing at the fabric of American society. For many Americans, particularly those of the younger generation, the Vietnam War represented a moral quagmire. The justifications for the war, the domino theory, and the fight against communism rang hollow in the face of the mounting casualties and the devastating images flickering across their television screens. The draft, which had become increasingly inequitable, further fueled resentment. Students in particular faced the agonizing prospect of being shipped off to fight in a war they did not understand or support. The anti-war movement, initially confined to college campuses and intellectual circles, began to gain traction among wider segments of the population. Protests erupted across the country, from small towns to major cities, as Americans from all walks of life voiced their opposition to the war. The movement was a heterogeneous mix of students, veterans, clergy, artists, and everyday citizens, united by their shared belief that the war was a tragic mistake. The government's response to the growing anti-war sentiment was often dismissive and at times heavy-handed. Protests were met with police brutality. Dissent was often labeled as unpatriotic or even treasonous. The administration attempted to discredit the anti-war movement, portraying it as a fringe element out of touch with mainstream America. However, the sheer number of protesters and the diversity of their backgrounds belied this characterization. The decision to expand the war into Cambodia in 1970 proved to be a tipping point for many Americans. The expansion of the war into Cambodia was the spark that ignited the protests at Kent State and on campuses across the country. The decision to expand the Vietnam War into Cambodia in the spring of 1970 was met with widespread condemnation and outrage. President Nixon's announcement of the incursion, framed as a necessary measure to disrupt North Vietnamese supply lines, struck many as a blatant attempt to widen a war that was already deeply unpopular. The invasion of Cambodia, a neutral country, was seen as a dangerous escalation of the conflict, further dragging the United States into the quagmire of Southeast Asian politics. The news of the Cambodian incursion sent shockwaves through college campuses across the United States. Students, already disillusioned by the war and angered by the draft, saw the expansion of the conflict as a betrayal of their generation. Protests erupted across the country, with students demanding an immediate withdrawal from Vietnam and an end to the bombing of Cambodia. The invasion of Cambodia had poured gasoline on the already raging fire of student dissent. At Kent State University, the reaction to the Cambodian invasion was swift and impassioned. Students organized rallies, marches, and teach-ins to express their opposition to the war and the Nixon administration's handling of the conflict. The atmosphere on campus was tense, a reflection of the deep divisions within American society over the war. The protests at Kent State were part of a larger nationwide wave of student activism that swept the country in the wake of the Cambodian invasion. Adding fuel to the fire of student protests was the issue of draft deferments. The draft, a system designed to ensure a steady supply of manpower for the armed forces, had become a source of deep resentment and division during the Vietnam War. The system, many argued, was inherently unfair, disproportionately impacting working-class and minority youth while offering numerous deferments and exemptions to those with the means and connections to avoid service. Student deferments in particular were a point of contention. College students, typically from more affluent backgrounds, could obtain deferments that allowed them to postpone their service while they pursued their education. This system created a two-tiered system that exacerbated class divisions and fueled resentment among those who could not afford to attend college or who felt a moral obligation to serve their country, regardless of their personal beliefs about the war. The ending of student draft deferments was a significant factor contributing to the student protests at Kent State and other universities. The prospect of losing their deferments and facing the very real possibility of being drafted into the military filled many students with dread and anger. They saw the draft as a form of involuntary servitude, a system that robbed them of their agency and forced them to participate in a war they believed was unjust.